Randall, how's it going?
I am great. How are you?
Good. Dude, I gotta tell you, I was thinking about this just, probably a half hour before I jumped on here. It's weird how this worked, right? Because, like, you reached out to me like 2 weeks ago, and then, like, a week later, I'm like, hey, man, you want to go to war? And, like, here we are, right? It is nuts. Like, every time I think that, the Lord is out of surprises for me, he gently reminds me, no, 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 you're just getting started. But man, I sure appreciate you coming on.
Sure. Let me give you a little bit of background on me so that your
Yeah.
listeners know who you're talking to. My name is Randall Edwards. I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing law for over 40 years now. Grew up in central Utah, good old Richfield, Utah, fifth generation Mormon. Grew up Mormon. Went on a mission in Brazil and went to BYU reluctantly. Wasn't that crazy about going to BYU, but I had a great time there. In fact, I ran for student body vice president as a joke, and we won and immediately resigned. That was just fun. I, uh, I went to, well, I got the thing I needed at BYU. I got a wife, so I immediately needed an education. So I went to the University of Utah Law School and left there, went to work in the Nevada Supreme Court for a year, and then I bounced between Nevada and Utah. I've been in solo private practice now for about 20 years. Before that, I worked for different government agencies and for a couple of law firms. And among the things that I have done is a lot of religious rights kind of stuff. I mean, when you go to law school, you talk about constitutional rights, and it seems like it's so exciting. And you think I'm this is going to be great. I'm going to learn about the Constitution, but you hardly ever use it in real life unless you were a criminal defense lawyer. And the only thing you use there are, the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment. But when I was doing some work, and I got a call from this fundamentalist school in rural Nevada. And what had happened is they were out in the middle of nowhere, and they were attached to an evangelical. When I say fundamentalist, I mean fundamentalist Christian. They were evangelicals, and they had a school that was attached to them. And Elko County had come to them and said, "You have got to bus your kids all the way into Elko and all the way back every day," which was an hour each way, because we don't think that you've come up to snuff as far as all of the curriculum that you need. So they called me up and said, "Do we have to do that?" And usually, when I look at something like that, I try to figure out, is there something else behind it? Because I went over there and I looked at their curriculum, and it was all Bible based. I mean, it was a whole program that had been put together by this group of evangelical Christians who had these schools all over. And as it turns out, yeah, there was a federal grant that was involved. And if they didn't have a certain number of schools, children in the district, they weren't going to get all the grant money. So they wanted to bring these kids in. And that started me down the road of doing some religious rights stuff. And it was very interesting. I had, as soon as word got out that, here's a lawyer who does some religious rights cases, I started getting them from all over Nevada and all over the Western United States. I started the Nevada Christian Education Association. It was fun. We had a big meeting at this big Baptist church. And I remember they listened to me, and I got up and talked about, all of the religious rights kind of things and things that we need to be looking for. And, you've got to make sure that your curriculum is good and that kind of thing. And afterwards, we're having lunch. And one of these pastors comes up, and you could tell this guy was from the buckle of the Bible Belt. And he says, "Brother Edwards." Now, I thought it was a great thing that he was calling me brother. He says,
Yeah, it
I'm
seems familiar, doesn't it?
yeah, he says, "I understand you're a Mormon." I said, "Yeah, that's true. And I understand that the reason you got here is because the ACLU sent you. Is that right?" I said, "Well, I've done some work for the American Civil Liberties Union. So I've got two strikes against me already. I'm
Right.
working for
Right.
liberal ACLU, and I'm a Mormon." And he looks at me and he goes, "I've been listening to you, and sometimes I listen to you and I think there's a chance you might be saved." So, well, I'm feeling better about that. so So word got out. I've done some religious rights stuff. I have represented a lot of fundamentalist Mormons in various areas. I've in fact I represented one fundamentalist Mormon against another fundamentalist Mormon that had to do with a property dispute, and that was an interesting story. A lot of situations in which somebody is discriminated against because of their religion. Because I practice in Utah. Well, I also practice in Nevada and California and Arizona. That's where I'm licensed. I mean, that's kind of where you're going to find the a core group of fundamentalist Mormons. And the fundamentalist Mormons who are there in the middle of, your mainline LDS are going to end up on the wrong side of some discriminatory kind of things. It's very interesting. And so, I don't know, it was probably 15 years ago when there was the big raid on the FLDS
Hmm.
compound in Texas. And I was contacted by the American Bar Association, which is a big group of lawyers. I mean, it's a national organization. And they have newsletters that they send out. They have different sections. And one of them was the state and local law section. And the reason that they called me was because my boss was a member of it. My former boss, who'd been the city attorney in Reno, Nevada. And they said, well, I understand you're a Mormon. I understand you know something about polygamy, and I understand you know something about religion. Can you write something for us? And so I did a little bit of research and found that the history of the LDS Church, the early history, and the way that it had progressed, at least up to that point, was really intriguing because there were a lot of real interesting principles. There were religion principles, family issues, and of course, most issues that have to do with religious um, controversies are usually about human sexuality.
Hmm.
You can find that right now. I mean, you have big splits in different Protestant denominations over whether they're going to have a gay clergy or not, or whether they're going to allow, any. Well, I mean, you've got child abuse issues in the Catholic Church. I mean, so that was a big issue. So I wrote this article about polygamy. Um, I called it Polygamy, the Relic of Barbarism That Won't Go Away. And I started off by talking a little bit about the 1953 Short Creek Raid down in, well, it's Hilldale in Colorado City, but then it was Short Creek. And the government of Arizona decided that they were going to come in and break it up, and they were going to stop all these people from, all of this, they got child brides, and we're going to take the kids away. And it was very reminiscent as to what it was happening in Texas at that time. And so, as I have, I mean, that was 15 years ago. Things have been very interesting in the interim. And that's what I wanted to talk about tonight is, first of all, how we got to where we are, and then where we are, because it is fascinating. Now, you will find that there are a lot of scholarly articles about Mormons and polygamy and constitutional law. When you go to law school, there is every law school has got a publication. It's called the Law Review, and if you're in the top percentage of your law school, you write a scholarly article for the Law Review. Well, in Utah, I mean, hot topic is going to be polygamy.
Right.
Because a lot going on in Utah. There's polygamists all over Utah, and the question is, what do you do about it, and how do you do something about it? And so there was a lot of law that came out of there. Now, we're also, some of the principles that I'm going to talk about they are expanded beyond what Mormons are doing. I mean, we've got issues of Muslims, for example, who are now polygamists in the United States. And you also have, there's a kind of an interesting little subculture among Black evangelicals where the men, a lot of them end up in
Hmm.
jail. And so then you will have these Black women who are looking around, and it's like, we've got to have somebody to help us. And so some Black evangelical churches have said, well, let's go back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and let's use that as a model. So that has been interesting, but most of the focus has always been on Mormon polygamy because there is not only a religious aspect, and there's a sexual aspect, and there's a constitutional law aspect, but it's good copy.
Sure.
So you're going to find there are a lot of scholarly books out there. I mean, there's one that was written by one of my law professors, Ed Firmage, A Legal History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from 1830 to 1900, called Zion in the Courts. There's another one that I just picked up just a little while ago. It's called The Mormon Question, Polygamy and Constitutional Conflict in 19th Century America. And that brings us up to, oh, probably about 1900. And anybody who's listening to your podcast will know that the transition from polygamy to monogamy, which was not easy, came about in large part as a result of a lot of legal stuff that the church was involved in.
Right.
And so, if you don't mind, I'll kind of go through kind of what the history is and then where we are today. My guess is that a lot of your listeners, especially who are fundamentalists, are thinking to themselves, well, do I need to be looking over my shoulder? Do I need to be worried about getting busted for, being in violation of the law because of my religious beliefs? Am I going to get prosecuted for bigamy or for
Right.
something? And so let me just kind of dive into where we are and how we got there, and then where we are today, because where we are today is in such an interesting spot from a legal standpoint. Now, I'm telling
Absolutely. So, Randall, before we carry on too much farther, maybe towards the end, I don't know. I'll leave that up to you. I do want to kind of go over what the impetus was for this particular episode because I feel like it's super important, right? I didn't just pick this topic out of a vacuum. You know what I mean?
well, we might want to just start there because this is a real life situation that we've got.
Sure. So there's a family that lives here in the States in a county, again, being super vague, who basically had a sheriff's deputy make a post on Facebook where she basically equated anybody who was living plural marriage to some really horrible people, folks engaged in pedophilia, that sort of thing. Some really nasty stuff was said, and then goes on to make a very thinly veiled threat.
Let me tell you, when I first talked to you about that, I was like, wait a minute, I've read about Davies County. I mean, it was one of the sites of the Mormon War in 1838. I mean, there is a long history of being mistreated by government actors toward Mormons.
Yeah,
Uh, that really piqued my curiosity, and we'll talk a little bit about what can be done, what can't be done, what should be done. But in order for us to get there, let me tell you where we started.
sure.
Um, I mean, I'm not going to start with the long sordid history of polygamy under common law in England, but let's start just with Joseph Smith, because that's really kind of where the big focus gets down to. The polygamy issue in the United States was Joseph Smith. It wasn't really a big issue before. Uh, and if anybody talked about bigamy, it was usually a matter of some guy who was married who then hoodwinked a woman into also marrying him, usually in a different state. He would have two wives, and then eventually he'd get caught. And that actually was the situation with John C. Bennett, who we'll talk about a little later. But it was everything changed with Joseph Smith, and we have, Joseph Smith, obviously, we all know the story if you're on this podcast. I mean, he goes into the woods to pray. He receives this vision. He is translating the Book of Mormon, and we talk about the very first reference to anything having to do with plural marriage. And frankly, I must tell you, I have a bias. I do not like the word polygamy very much. I prefer plural marriage if we're talking about it within the
Me
religious
too.
context.
Me too. Yep.
Polygamy is it's a different thing. It's a different concept than plural marriage. They are used interchangeably, even in the church. And I should probably mention for your listeners, I am an active LDS member. Like I said, I've represented a bunch of fundamentalists. I know where they're coming from. I understand where they are. But I don't consider myself to be either an independent fundamentalist or a member of any group. But we all have the same basic background
Right.
as far as all of that is concerned. And the facts are simply the facts. They are what they are. I mean, we have the first instance of Joseph Smith mentioning even anything about plural marriage in the Book of Mormon, which came out in 1830 or 1829, somewhere around in there. And we also have some indication historically that Joseph Smith was aware of at least the concept of plural marriage early on as well, 1830, 1831, somewhere around there. And in fact, we find out that later in the history of the church, Joseph F. Smith, who was Joseph Smith's nephew, in Utah at a funeral sermon said, when Joseph Smith first received the revelation in 1831 on plural marriage, some of those women that he was to be married to were shown to him, some of whom were not even members of the church. So we at least have the concept that is rolling around in Joseph Smith's head,
Right.
to those later witnesses. And we also have a little later on in 1831, where there's a recollection from W. Phelps, who was with Joseph Smith. And there was an indication that something having to do with plural marriage, because Joseph Smith said, we need to go bring in the Lamanites. We're going to go on a mission to the Lamanites, and we're going to marry these women. And somebody said, well, wait a minute, we're married. How are we going to do that? And Joseph Smith is reported to have said, in the same way that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. And so there was at least this idea that there was going to be plural marriage. There wasn't plural marriage at the time. And of course, there is some history indicating that there was a woman by the name of Fanny Alger who was working for Joseph Smith. And Oliver Cowdery later said that he thought that it was just an affair. There were others, such as Fanny Alger's brother, who said, no, she was his first plural wife. And this was in Kirtland, Ohio. This is years before Joseph Smith made polygamy, plural marriage, a doctrine of the church. But we have this indication. So now we have this issue of, first of all, what is the church's position on plural marriage? And also, what is the legal position on plural marriage? Now, everything that I'm going to talk about today is going to be controversial. There are a lot of sides to a lot of these stories. And what I can tell you is this is the best that I've got based on what it is that I've looked at the historical record. You're going to have those who are going to deny that Joseph Smith ever was involved in plural marriage. You're going to have those who are going to say that he started plural marriage early on, and that it never really left him. But the best that I can look at just from the legal standpoint and from the historical standpoint is what I'm going to talk about. I'm also going to tell you that some of your listeners may be lawyers. And so what it is that I'm going to talk about is going to sound pretty elementary to them. And some of them are historians, and that's going to sound elementary to them. But for most people, they're neither lawyers nor historians. And so it isn't that I'm going to dumb it down, but I'm kind of trying to simplify it to a point that you sort of understand what was going on and how things worked. For example, Joseph Smith there in Kirtland, Ohio, this is in the 1830s, 1831, 1832, he moved out to Kirtland. And there were people who were being baptized all the time, and they wanted to be married to each other. Well, in order to be someone who could marry somebody legally in Ohio, I mean, to officiate in a marriage, they had to be approved by the state. And they wouldn't do it for Joseph Smith. He was this upstart who, had just started this newfangled religion. And the question was, do I go ahead and do this, or do I have to have somebody else do it? Do I have to send them to a civil authority? Joseph Smith just married them. He just said, I'm authorized by God to do this, and the law of God is above the law of man. And if they don't like it, they can lump it. That was kind of the position that he took. And when we get into the issue of plural marriage, that is the position that was essentially always taken by the brethren. It was like, we know what the law might say. We might be able to appeal to the law. They tried to appeal to the law on several different fronts, but the law of God always trumped the law of the state.
Gotcha.
And it's one of those first instances of civil disobedience. I mean, you found that even back in those days, you had probably the great initial hero of civil disobedience in the United States, Henry David Thoreau,
Right.
who pay taxes for some reason, and they threw him in jail. And his good friend Ralph Waldo Emerson came to him and said, "Henry, what are you doing in jail?" And he says, I'm not going to pay these taxes." And then he looked at Emerson and said, "What are you doing out of jail? I mean, you need to be in here with me. I shouldn't be out there with you."
Can I ask a question real quick? I don't mean to derail you, but I feel it's kind of pertinent. At this time, are most municipalities requiring marriage licenses?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. And so it's still a marriage license kind of deal, right? Where that is like state sanctioning of your union essentially
Yes.
is what it boils down to. Where did the idea of marriage licenses start?
Well, that's an interesting question. And it kind of has this very strange kind of evolution in American law, but it has been there almost since the beginning. I mean, almost since the Pilgrims got here, was that we have to establish civil law. And in order for us to establish some sort of civil law and civilization, if you are going to be married to each other, there are certain responsibilities that come with that. I mean, the responsibility to stay faithful and to raise
Right.
children and responsible for your children, and to have some method whereby if you die, you have succession. So that, if you are married and you die, either with or without a will, it's presumed that that person to whom you are legally married is going to take the property and it's going to be
Mhm.
distributed to children. So the argument was, of course, the state has an interest in making sure that we know what's going on so that it isn't just a complete uh, lunatic asylum when something like that happens.
Gotcha.
And that was really the basis for it. And so the idea of the state being involved in a marriage, at least to the point of knowing who's getting married and how they're getting married and what happens, that was part of American law almost from the beginning. Now, what's also interesting there is that almost all marriages at the outset were religious marriages. So they were
Hmm.
done. And so there would be a registry in the church, but it would also be registered with the county. And almost all of well, there is no such thing as a federal marriage registration. Each state is in charge of its own marriage situation. We'll talk about how that has been usurped by the federal government in several instances. Gay marriage, for example. I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court a few years ago just said, we don't care what you've got in your state. We're saying that gay marriage, you have to do it. I mean,
Right.
it's sanctioned. I'm going to jump forward a little bit. In about 1963 or four, there was a interracial couple in Virginia. They were called, strangely enough, the Loving couple.
Hmm.
The Lovings, he was a black man, a white woman. Miscegenation, a marriage between a black man and a white woman, or vice versa, was outlawed in Virginia. And they just loved each other. They just want to get married to each other. And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And at that point, the court said, we don't care what your law is in Virginia. Their civil right to be able to be married to each other outweighs any interest that the state may have. And so the question is, how much interest does each state have in marriage? And even today, it differs.
Right.
Laws are different in different states. We'll talk about this in a minute. Adultery laws are different in each different state as well. There's some states in which adultery is still a crime. It's hard to believe in this day and age. And there are some in which it's just like, we've written that off the books. And there's some like Utah where it's like it's still on the books, but I don't think there's been an adultery prosecution probably for 100 years, probably not
Right.
since. But the point is that each state was regulating it, and each state was regulating who can perform a marriage, and they weren't going to let Joseph Smith do it. And he said, well, yeah, but I'm a prophet, and these people want to get married, and they want to be married in my church. And at that point, there was also a question as to, is the church going to be recognized by the state? Now, that's also another issue here, is to what degree does the state have an interest in your religion? First Amendment to the Constitution, very first words are, we're not going to interfere with the free exercise of religion or the establishment of religion. That's the first thing. It's after that that you've got, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and liberty and all of those other things. And so the question is just to what degree does any state have any interest in how you believe and what you believe? And that has always been a point of contention between the Mormons and the state, because the Mormons were revolutionary. They were revolutionary in what they taught, but probably more importantly, they were revolutionary in the sense that they were cohesive, and as a result, they were a political force. Now,
Mhm.
as I said, when I look into any kind of a law, any kind of rule, I always ask the question, what's really at stake here? And we'll get into the Nauvoo period in a minute, but does the state, do they really care who you get married to? Or is it really a matter of politics? Who's got the power?
Mhm.
Because if a group of Mormons carry the power, maybe going after them for polygamy, that's just eyewash. You're just going after that's just what you're saying out there. But what you really want to do is you really want to stop them as a force. You really want to disincorporate them. You want to
Mm.
destroy them. So we have the issue of marriage. You actually have a church articles that are incorporated on marriage, and that becomes part of the Doctrine and Covenants back then. And it says we're monogamous. We believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. Now, there's some question as to whether Joseph Smith was behind that or whether that was a declaration that was made by Oliver Cowdery and just sort of came about while Joseph Smith was out of town. But in any case, it made its way into the scriptures. And that is something that later the reorganized church, now known as the Community of Christ, hung their hat on and said Joseph Smith was never polygamous. See, this was always in the church articles.
Right.
We'll go a little further down the line. So we got this first plural wife. We're not sure whether it was a plural wife or not. Like I said, Oliver Cowdery said that it was adulterous. And ultimately, that's what got Oliver Cowdery thrown out of the church. He made an accusation against Joseph Smith and said, "You're an adulterer." And Joseph Smith said, "No, I was never an adulterer. I had another wife, but I wasn't committing adultery." Because to
Mm.
somebody being an adulterer meant you're a criminal. Adultery was a crime in Ohio at the time.
Right.
Bigamy was a crime in Ohio at the time. Now, then we get into what is the definition of bigamy. And as I was looking things up just today, the definition of bigamy is all over the map. As I said, every single state has its own criminal code. And bigamy in some cases is I am married and I purport to legally marry somebody else. That would be bigamy in Ohio, for example. So was he doing that? Well, no, he wasn't out there trying to get a marriage license. But then you kind of say, well, then what is it? If it's not bigamy and it's not adultery, what is it? Well, to come back and say, well, she was my spiritual wife. There was no legal category within which that could actually fit.
Right.
So there was that issue. In the end, what happens is the word is that Emma found Joseph and Fanny Alger out in the barn, apparently in some compromising position. We don't know what that was. But in the end, she throws her out of the house. Fanny leaves the church, marries somebody else. And when she's asked about it, she said, "I have nothing to say about this. That's between me and God and Joseph Smith. I'm not getting involved in this."
Wow.
So we go a little further. And we have, of course, two centers of the church. One of them is in Kirtland and one of them is in Missouri. And the Saints are not having a good time in Missouri. They're having a rough, rough time. And we have this whole issue of, is plural marriage part of that? There were certainly rumors of plural marriage even back in Kirtland. And granted, plural marriage was something that was outside the norm of any kind of mainline Christian church then. Most people out on the frontier were Protestants, not a lot of Catholics, certainly not very many Jews. And it's funny, Joseph Smith at one point said, "I will defend the right of any Mohammedan Muslim."
Mhm.
I'll bet there wasn't a Muslim within 500 square miles of any place that Joseph Smith ever was.
Right.
But nonetheless, it was like, I'll defend their rights too. But there were these rumors of what was going on even out in Missouri. But was that the real issue? The real issue, now remember where we are. We're in the late 1830s. What's the big issue out there in Missouri? Slavery. And now you have this group of people. Most of them are Northerners. Most of them believe that you've got this is the promised land. Adam on Diamond, that's where Adam was.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to vote together as a block. Well, the slave owners in Missouri didn't like that one bit. So how are we going to deal with this? We're going to come up with all sorts of pretexts to go after the Mormons. But what it really gets down to is we've got to get them out of here because they're a voting bloc and they're going to hurt us.
Right.
That we burn them out. We have Hans Mill. We have the Mormon War. But ultimately, we have a governor who says, you may legally exterminate the Mormons. You can get rid of them. You can kill them with impunity.
Ooh. Yeah.
It's scary. And the thing that's even more scary about it, where was one of the hotbeds? Daviess County, Missouri. Like I said, there's a long history of anti-Mormonism out there. And the kind of allegations against the Mormons right now are the kind of allegations that were made back then, intended to inflame people, intended to get people worked up about these Mormons. They're here, they're outsiders, they're troublemakers. We need to get rid of them. And ultimately, we've got Joseph Smith, who's in the Liberty Jail, which I think is the most
The dungeon.
his name. Yeah, Liberty Jail. There's a contradiction in terms. And he escapes. By the way, you know where he was headed when he escaped? They were taking him out of Liberty Jail and sending him to Daviess County. That's where he was supposed to end up next in jail.
Ooh.
So, and he actually pays off the jailers and says, okay, look, fellas, I don't have any money on me, but I'll give you this promissory note. And if you'll just let us go, when we finally get settled, you can come and get the money. And they all got drunk. They all went to sleep. They escape. The crack up of this is that sheriff shows up in Nauvoo a couple of years later and says, here's the note. When do I get paid? And Joseph Smith paid him. It's a
Man of his word. Man of his word. Good.
great story.
Good on Joseph.
So it's in Nauvoo that because Joseph is no longer on the run, that's when he receives all of the really interesting and all of the very unique doctrines of the Restoration. That's where he gets baptism for the dead. That's where he gets temple ceremonies. We'd already had some indication of the 3 degrees of glory. That's where plural marriage comes in. That's where the idea of a council of 50 and a kingdom of God comes in. It's where the second anointing is part of all of that. All of those things are associated with Nauvoo. And at every given point in Joseph Smith's history, you have people who would join the church and they would say, I'm willing to go with you this far, but if you go one step further, I'm done. I'm out of here.
Right.
And Joseph Smith said, there are people who they'll follow me anywhere. But as soon as I introduce something that's contrary to their traditions, they fly apart like glass. And they are the worst. They are the worst enemies that I have because, and you can imagine what that is. We trusted you. We thought that you were the prophet. And the next thing you know, you're telling us, whatever. You're telling us that there's a pre-existence and there's this weird thing where you're baptizing people who are dead and you can be married again. Well, when he started in with plural marriage, it's very interesting. One of his plural wives, a woman by the name of Mary Elizabeth Leitner, she knew Joseph Smith from the time that she was young. She was actually living on the Morley farm in Kirtland, Ohio. She was a young woman, and you've probably heard several stories about her because she shows up over and over and over. She's kind of like Forrest Gump. She keeps showing up in all these different places. She's there. She's a young girl. And Isaac Morley, who was one of the early converts, along with Sidney Rigdon, has one copy of the Book of Mormon. And she's maybe 8 or 9 years old. And she begs, can I just take this book? And I just want to read it. And he says, yeah, but you have to bring it back by tomorrow. You can look at it. Well, she comes back the next day and Joseph is there. And she hands the book back to Isaac Morley, and he says, I'll bet you didn't read any of it. And she rattles off by heart the first 10 or so verses of First Nephi.
Whoa.
Joseph Smith says, honey, you can have this book. I'll get another one for Brother Morley. We have that situation. We also have her out in Missouri. And you have probably heard the story of, they are publishing the very first book of commandments.
Mm-hmm.
Mob comes in and they invade and they burn down the press. But there are a bunch of still raw sheets of the Book of Commandments that have not yet been put into book form. And these two young girls get as much of that as they can, and they go out into a cornfield and they hold it, they hide them out there while the mobsters are all looking for them in this cornfield. One of them was Mary Elizabeth Lightner Rollins.
Mm.
Joseph Smith later, in about 1841, 1842, he says to her, God gave you to me from before we were born. And God let me know when I first met you that you were to be mine. And he says, in 1831, God told me that you were to be my wife. And Mary Elizabeth Lightner said, well, it would have been nice for you to told me that. Besides, I was in Missouri and I was married to somebody else. So there's that kind of indication as to what was going on. And how it was, the reason that I bring this up is that he told her from 1831 to about 1842, I had this concept of plural marriage. I knew that it was something that I was supposed to restore, but I didn't want to do it. And you can imagine that he didn't want to do it. And he told her, an angel came to me 3 times and said, if you don't do this, we'll find somebody who will. And the story that he told her, that she then wrote in a letter later, was that the last time the angel came with a drawn sword. Now, I don't think he was in any danger of being, speared by an angel, but it was like, I'm serious about this, Joseph.
Right.
And we have this indication that Joseph was like, well, okay, what I'll start with is I will seal women who are already passed away, who are already dead. I'll seal them to me. And ultimately, whether it was a direct revelation to him or whether it was an angel or what the story was, finally it was like, you need to start sealing living women to you. And that's where, of course, we have the intersection between the law and God. Now,
Before we move on there, one of the things I often get pressed on by polygamy deniers is, why don't we have more from Joseph Smith on living polygamy? And I think the answer to this isn't complicated, right? Why does Brigham feel he can talk about more? Because he left the country, right?
yeah,
People forget Utah wasn't even a territory. It was Mexico still.
yeah.
And so Brigham has certain latitudes that Joseph didn't have. I mean, let's face it, they were willing to kill him over a new book of scripture. Can you imagine what would have happened had he shattered their Victorian sensibilities with this idea of plural marriage in that day? He wouldn't have stood a chance. I mean,
Here again, I want to add to that. You're right. You're absolutely right about that. There were a couple of times that he sort of hinted at it
yes.
in public. At one point, he got up and he started talking about, the restoration of all things is going to include the restoration of all of the ordinances, including those that were given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he said that in the morning. Between then and the afternoon session, he had a group of people who came to him and said, wait, what are you talking about, Joseph? You're not talking about polygamy, are you? I mean, if you are, we're going to be in trouble. And that afternoon, he got up and he said, remember everything I said this morning? I retract it all. So he would kind of go, he would try to move it along to that point. But it was obviously something that was going to cause a rift. Now, again, let's get to what's behind it, though. What is happening? By the time they get to Illinois, the Mormons have been driven out from Missouri, and they're angry. They've had their farms burned down. They've had the property they paid for with blood, sweat, and tears taken away from them. And they start making petitions to the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be reimbursed. We want our religious rights. We want the people of Missouri to pay us for the things that they stole from us. They are a political force. Now, is larger than Chicago at that point. The greatest concentration of political power is there on the bend of the Mississippi River in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith, who is seen as, the great poobah of the politics there, is seen as a political force. And you had both people from the Whig Party and also from the Democratic Republican Party in there trying as best they can to woo this guy, to make sure that they will vote for them. So they would, one of the things that they did was they passed the Nauvoo Charter. And the Nauvoo Charter basically made the city of Nauvoo a nation unto itself. It had its own court system. It had its own police force. It had its own militia, for that matter. And that was all because we'll give you whatever you want if you'll just keep us in office. Political power is a lot behind this. So if Joseph Smith had come out in favor of polygamy himself, that would have been one more reason to knock this guy out. Now, but let's talk about that for a second. A lot of people have said, well, the thing that led to Joseph Smith's death was because he destroyed the Nauvoo Expositor. And the reason that the Nauvoo Expositor had to be destroyed was because they were letting polygamy out of the bag to everybody. But if we look at history, we realize that's not the case. We'd already had a guy who'd been the assistant president of the church, John C. Bennett, who had written this book called History of the Saints. And in that book, he says, Joseph Smith is more than just a polygamist. He's an adulterer, he's an abuser, he's this, he's that, he's stealing other men's wives. And he was going around the country making all of these accusations, and he was doing these lectures all over. So was the first time that anybody heard about it in the Nauvoo Expositor? Not at all. The Nauvoo Expositor, in fact, was just that. It was a pretext. Again, you had hordes of people from Missouri who were coming to take over and to destroy Joseph Smith in the same way that, or destroy the Mormons in the same way that they had in Missouri. Word had gone, when they showed up in Carthage, they didn't know anything about the Nauvoo Expositor. That had only happened a week before. They'd been moving from Missouri for months so that they could take over. Why? Two things. First of all, if we can knock these people out of here, we can take their property, just as we did in Missouri. And of course, you have the people in Illinois who are more than happy to step in and take over these farms that have been cultivated out of the swampland. And also politics. If we get rid of these guys, we won't have a bloc that is voting against us or messing with us. Here again, remember, 1840s, 1844 is when Joseph Smith died. What's the big issue? Slavery. Most of those people are Northerners. And so you've got this issue. And I don't know that we can overemphasize the importance of slavery in the American psyche back then. It affected everything. If you were, the worst decisions that ever came from the Supreme Court had to do with slavery. The Dred Scott decision, right, where there was a black man who had escaped. I think he'd gone to the North and ultimately got sent back. And the Supreme Court said, well, yeah, you can do what you want with your property. They weren't human beings. They were just property. And Joseph Smith had taken a very interesting take on it. He was like, yeah, I think we should free the slaves. And the way we should do it is we should compensate the people who we are taking them from. So we're going to treat them like property, but we're also going to free them because we know they're human beings. And we're going to sell public lands and pay these people for the slaves that way. It was very innovative what it is. People have wondered, well, why is it that Joseph Smith was running for president? Did he really think that he had a chance of being the president of the United States? No, of course not. He is sort of like a third-party candidate, where if he could throw support to one side or the other, perhaps there was a chance, number one, they wouldn't come and invade us and destroy us. And there's always that faint hope that we might actually get paid for the property that was stolen from us in Missouri. So that was really what was behind that. But we look into, again, polygamy. What's the law and what's going on in polygamy? Things don't really heat up legally until they get out to Utah, but I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Nauvoo.
Okay.
Got any questions so far?
Dude, it's awesome. Yeah, keep going. I'm enjoying this.
Okay. Well,
I will say this. I've wondered, and this is just my musings. Nobody should take this. You should take a whole spoonful of salt with this because this is just my personal musings. But I understand what Joseph was trying to do in running for president, right? Because you're right. I don't think even he thought he had a chance at winning, but he did have an opportunity to influence the election, right?
yeah.
And I've often wondered if there weren't some federal actors involved in this whole thing as well, right? He's running for president. He could upend an election, and it's made me wonder, you know, perhaps there is federal interest involved in this as well, not just state and local,
Well, of
because
course.
he could mess some stuff up for either the incumbent or the challenger.
Well, of course, there were federal interests that were involved because, well, first of all, let's none of us be under the illusion that Washington, D.C. was any cleaner back then than it is today, or for that matter, that people were less polarized than they are today. I don't think you could find a more polarizing issue than slavery. I mean, either you believed that Black people were human beings and deserved civil rights, or you believed they were property and they were nothing. They were like cattle. They were like your house. They were like your field. I mean, they could be bought and sold. And it's awfully difficult to find any kind of middle ground there. So were there federal interests? Yeah. And we see what those federal interests were a mere 20 years later when we're in the middle of a civil war and the federal government is trying to maintain a union, and you've got state interests that are saying, keep away from us. Interestingly enough, even the southern states had a federal government. They had the Confederate states, and it
Mm-hmm.
was a confederation, but nonetheless, there was going to be that. So yeah, there were federal interests that were involved. There were political interests all over the place. And as you look at kind of what was going on, you realize that politics was not only not any less dirty than it is now, but it was probably even worse because now we've got the internet. I mean, if somebody really is corrupt, somebody's going to find something. There's going to be some sort of evidence that you're going to be able to find. You're going to be able to track down a bank account, and you're going to be able to say that bunch of ones and zeros in a digital account can be traced to that guy. You couldn't do that back in 1844. I mean,
Right.
dirty money. And in fact, dirty money was all cash. I mean, there was sort of a check system, and Kirtland, Ohio was one of those situations where they they tried those kind of notes and it all fell apart. But when it really got down to it, the politics were a mess. And again, Joseph Smith kept saying, look, we just want our constitutional rights. And we'll find out later, the Constitution pretty much let him down. I mean, you find in section 110 of the LDS Doctrine and Covenants that he went to the Lord and he said, tell me about the Constitution. And it was like, well, here's the Constitution of the country, and anything more or less than that comes of evil. And it was a very interesting kind of state as to what the Constitution meant. But one of the points was the very First Amendment guarantees us religious freedom. We should be able to do whatever we want. And of course, like I said, you're right. In Victorian America, coming out and saying, we think that it's a great idea that you should have more than one wife. That is part of the restoration of all things. Like I said, people would get up to one point and then they'd say, we're out. Well, when that even became even semi-public, Joseph Smith was telling certain members of the church, it's presumed that when the saints were driven out of Nauvoo, there were probably 200 people that were involved in plural marriage at that point. So he told Joseph Smith, he told the Council of the 12, and he'd also presented the revelation that ultimately was Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, to the Nauvoo High Council and to the 12. And there were three people who had real issues with it. One of them was William Law, who was a counselor in the first presidency. One of them was William Marks, who was the president of the Nauvoo stake. And one of them was Leonard Sobey, and he had another position that I can't remember. But they said, absolutely not, not going to happen. And that was what ultimately got down to the Nauvoo Expositor. I have a stereotype copy of the Nauvoo Expositor. It's very interesting because they say, we believe if Mormonism. And we believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet up until he came up with that crazy stuff. Up until about two things they had problems with. One of them was was plural marriage, and the other one was the multiplicity of gods that had been introduced in the King Follett discourse. And they said, they all said, that's where we get off. That's where we're leaving. So, like I said, I don't think anybody was worked up about the Nauvoo Expositor. And I've got a great book. It was published a couple of years ago by Eborn Books called The Murder of Joseph Smith. It's by a guy by the name of LeGrand Baker. I don't know who he is, but if you got the name LeGrand, you know it's a Mormon guy.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's certain
Yeah.
names you're going to have, LeGrand. Although my very favorite Mormon Utah name is a woman by the name of, honestly, Latrina. Come on, really?
Her parents hated her. Um,
Yeah. Were
uh,
you, how far down the road were you thinking about that?
right, right.
But
It,
he points out that if he did a survey of all of the newspapers in that time period, nobody was worked up about shutting down a press that had had one press run. I mean, if they'd have shut down maybe the New York Times, that would have been something else. But somebody comes up with a press, it's like I'm putting out I'm doing mimeograph sheets right now, and somebody comes by and says you can't really do that. They're shutting me down. I can't see anybody, deciding to try and kill somebody over that. That was just the trigger. They needed to get him. And in fact, when he was arrested and went to Carthage, they didn't arrest him for knocking down the press. They went after him for treason. Why treason? Well, treason is when you commit a crime against the state. He could have gotten out from under that, but treason was a non-bailable offense. You couldn't bail out of jail with treason. You could if it was destruction of property. You could if it was assault and battery. But if it was treason, they kept you in jail. And while he is awaiting to be heard by a judge in Carthage, which is the county seat, he can't leave. They can't bail him out. And that's when the mob comes in and kills him.
I see. That's fascinating, right? Because you start to see the political mechanisms at work here. It's also one of the few crimes that almost always back in those days carried the death penalty as well, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken. And I think it's worth pointing out too here that right people, especially not antagonistic non-Mormons, will say, "Well, I mean, how much influence could they have wielded, right, in those days?" People forget Nauvoo was bigger than Chicago in its heyday. It was on its way to becoming a massive population center within the heartland of the United States. And that had to unnerve a few people. The fact they have the Nauvoo Legion, um, the fact that they are the only, in my estimation, counterculture up to that point within the United States that is thriving. And
Well,
I think that's worrying to a lot of people.
it was very worrying to them. And I would give you a modern counterpart to that. I mean, I think if you look at Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you have a very high concentration of Muslims. And now you have certain people I think it's mostly the Republicans who are freaking out over that. And they're saying, wait a minute, if these people all vote as a bloc, soon it's going to be Sharia law. We're going to end up with Muslim law that's going to impose, and it's going to spread throughout the United States. I mean, you're always going to have a group out there that is saying, if you have this people that are out of the mainstream, but they've got a majority and they actually are able to control a voting bloc, they are a danger to us. And that was what the Mormons were.
Right.
And Joseph Smith was seen as this, this dictator essentially. And you had people who would come out, they'd visit him, and they say, we're shocked at the way that this guy is. We thought that he was just, we thought that he was the equivalent of some, kind of dictator. He's just like a regular guy. We got off the boat, we found him down there, he was just chopping wood. He seemed like a really nice farm guy from New York. And at one point, I'm trying to remember the guy who later wrote, I mean, it was like in the 1870s, 1880s, he wrote about his day in Nauvoo. And he said to Joseph Smith, don't you think that having all of this political power in your hands, I mean, do you think that's safe? And Joseph Smith is reported to have said something like, in the hands of anybody else, it would be, but I'm a prophet. And then they said, well, how do you rule these people? He says, I don't rule them. I just teach them principles. They govern themselves. I don't have to govern them. I teach them what comes from heaven. Well, to anybody who doesn't believe that, it looks pretty scary to have somebody who's there. And we have modern counterparts that people look at. It's like, well, wait a minute, we got David Koresh, and he's got this little group of Branch Davidians down there, and he's trying to make things happen. And what's the only thing we can do? We got to burn him out. We got to destroy him. And you will find that a lot. It's a terrible legacy that we have in the United States, that when we have a religious group that is so far out of the mainstream, first of all, we've got rumors about them, then we've got all sorts of scare tactics, then suddenly they're the greatest public menace, and then we've got to move against them. And that was
Right.
essentially what's going on in Nauvoo.
Right.
Joseph Smith didn't institute polygamy as a doctrine of the church, but he did tell the 12, he did tell others, this has been revealed to me. Now, what about the law? Well, at the time that Joseph Smith was arrested, he had been charged by William Law of adultery. And there was a criminal complaint that was made up by, can you imagine today a member of the first presidency making out a criminal complaint against the president of the church?
Right. That would be insanity.
Yeah, I can't even imagine such a thing. But that was the situation. William Law had been excommunicated. He was angry about it. He was upset. And he thought Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. And of course, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I think hell hath no fury like William Law. And he was upset, and he made it out. Now, would Joseph Smith have been able to beat that? Probably. And it's because the way that the law of adultery read, it was that you were having, I mean, adultery was to have sexual relations outside of your own marriage. And a polygamous marriage was not considered to be a marriage. I mean, they didn't apply for a license. It would have been considered to be, but it also had to be open and obvious. And that was the one thing that polygamy was not, was open and obvious. Now, if Joseph Smith had gone in and had to actually defend himself and say, well, yeah, it's true, I was having sex with this woman, but it wasn't open and obvious until William Law made it open and obvious, it would have been devastating. But he died before it ever went to court. And of course, then the charge went against him as well.
Ooh, holy cow. It's just, especially like, I know the story, right? But what I don't know is what you're illuminating here, which are the political ramifications and the powers, the political powers at play here. And that's what I find fascinating.
Well, here's what we find. When you're growing up in the church, as I did, and you take a church history course, or I mean, seminary, or you take one in institute or whatever, you get one side of the story. Now, as a lawyer, I understand what it's like to give one side of the story. I only give my side of the story when I am putting together a brief for a client. I'll say, okay, here are the facts, but here's how you should really read them. And basically, the history that we've gotten from the church is the church's legal brief. Here's what really happened. They were persecuted because of their beliefs, and they were persecuted because of that. And Joseph was a prophet, and these other people were influenced by Satan, etc. If you got the legal brief from the other side, it would be completely different. The legal brief would be, these people came in, they're outsiders. They told us that they were going to take all of our lands. They told us that this was the land of Zion and we needed to get out of here. And they said that they were going to do away with slavery. And suddenly, we're on the outs and we just got to defend ourselves. And usually, when I go to court, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But the one thing that we do need to be aware of is that usually, in almost every case having to do with Mormons, there's a political aspect behind the scenes. And what we're talking about with polygamy is all just a pretext. That's the trigger that you use because it's easy.
Hmm.
It's so out there that you can say, see, these people don't deserve to be here. They shouldn't even be in the United States. We need to get rid of them. We need to destroy them. And while we're at it, we're going to take all their land. I mean, they're no better than, well, we'll talk about what the US Supreme Court said, but they're no better than the alien hordes, and they are probably even subhuman.
Mm.
There was later an attempt to stop anybody who was a member of the church who had been converted in a different land from being able to immigrate to the United States because they were subhuman.
All for
Because,
being Mormon.
yeah, the mere fact they had joined the church meant that they weren't white. They weren't white enough. Why? Because they subscribed to that Asiatic practice of plural marriage.
Interesting.
Asiatic practice that the Muslims have. That's what we don't like. And so the Mormons were now trying to take you backwards. They were trying to de-evolve. And that was the argument. Of course, you ignore the whole point that, well, that whole Asiatic practice came from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon. I mean,
Right.
there are a lot more eons of people who were polygamous than there were monogamous. But
Right.
that didn't factor in because it wasn't American history. So they leave. Joseph is killed. Brigham Young ultimately takes over the church. At first, the 12 apostles take over. But remember, the 12 apostles had all been introduced to plural marriage. And it was known among some members of the church. And of course, it became better known. Now, there's a lot of history that I'm skipping here.
Mhm.
Part of it, John C. Bennett, who, when he finds out that plural marriage is out there in Nauvoo, he's like, well, hey, I'm a good red-blooded American boy, and I'm going to take advantage of this. So he goes out and just starts. He just starts in on different women, and he's just seducing them all. And he's like, "Hey, Joseph is good with this. Everybody knows that. So if we just have sex and nobody finds out about it, it's going to be good." So
Mhm.
at every single step, you're going to have another side that's going to somehow manage to to denigrate it and to make it bad. But by the time that the Mormons are leaving and they're on their way to Utah, it's a big enough of a sacrifice that you're not going to find a lot of people who are going to try and take advantage of that situation. I mean, you really have to want to go to Utah to be part of the Mormon exodus. So they get to Utah, 1847. Um, and here again, there is polygamy going on, but it isn't an official part of the church. It isn't an official doctrine. Officially, they still have that declaration of marriage that was in the first book of commandments. In 18, I think, well, and as you said, when the Mormons got here, it was Mexico. So they're outside the United States. Now, they weren't too worried about, is Mexico going to come in here and try?
Right.
No. In fact, just the opposite. You'll find out as you look at legal history that the Mormons started up their own court system. They had their own Supreme Court. They had their own legislature. It was intended that this would be, for all intents and purposes, a separate nation.
Right.
Deseret. And in fact, they had their own flag. And in fact, they had their own alphabet. I mean, they were
Yep.
so separated from the rest of American society that they were a people apart. And it was at that point that you now start to look at the Journal of Discourses. And now all of the doctrinal innovations that came during the Brigham Young period, they're free to talk about because they're no longer a threat to the United States. They're not in the United States. Aha. Well, what are those Mormons doing out there? In 1850, the Utah Territory is established, and that's a federal thing. So you've got the federal government that says this is a federal territory. And they kind of get around it by saying, well, okay, you've already got a system set up here. Brigham Young is going to be the first territorial governor. And he was fine. Everybody seemed to be fine with that until about 1852. It was in August of 1852 that there was a public announcement that celestial plural marriage was a tenet of the church. Now, here again, we get into the question of what's behind this? Where are the Mormons going to go? And are they going to be allowed to vote as citizens of a federal territory? And if so, how are they going to vote? 1856 comes along. The Whig Party in America has now pretty much spent itself. And you have a new party, the Republican Party. They have their first national convention. And the Democrats have got James Buchanan. The Republicans have got John C. Fremont, who, by the way, had happened to have explored all over Utah. He was a big explorer. Well, John C. Fremont is there, and they adopt a platform, the Republican platform. And it said, we wish to destroy the
Yep.
twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. And it's about that time that word gets out, these Mormons are having none of it. These Mormons, I mean, they're marrying people left and right, and they think that they are their own country. So what happens? President James Buchanan says, well, let's show them who's boss. And he starts sending out federal troops. Now, this is an interesting story. Brigham Young had already been driven out of Kirtland and driven out of Missouri, driven out of Illinois. And he was like, they're not driving us out again. If they come to Salt Lake City, if they invade, we will burn every damn thing here to the ground. And that was, and he abandoned Salt Lake City and everybody went to Provo. And when they got here, they're marching up and down the street. There's nobody's here. They already had the foundation of the Salt Lake Temple, and they covered it up. So you've got the general who comes into Salt Lake City and he goes, there's just a field here. Why did they put a wall around it? Well, I don't know, but okay, there's nothing here because they were having none of it. Well, in the end, the Utah war didn't become a war. There was kind of a war in the sense that you did have Mormons who would go out and they'd raid the federal troops. But one of the issues had to do with essentially who's in charge of Utah. Is it going to be these Mormons and their phony priesthood, or are we going to do it? Well, ultimately, they keep sending out all of these governors from Washington, D.C., federal governors come here, and they want to wipe out polygamy. Among the other things, like I said, that's usually a trigger. That's usually the big issue, but it's not the real issue. The real issue is who's going to dominate the politics out here. Because they would say, well, polygamy is, it's immoral. It's wrong. And yet you had some of these governors who'd come out here. They came out here with their mistresses.
Right.
They had like 2 or 3 with them. So the Mormons were like, what are you talking about? This has nothing to do with morality. This has to do with political power. Remember, there's always a political aspect behind all of this.
Right. Randall, can I ask you a quick question? Because this is something I've wondered about. At this time, we're getting close to putting it's not quite the Civil War yet, but are there plans in place for things like the Transcontinental Railroad yet? Are there
Yes.
plans in place for businessmen for the minerals that were in Utah? Because Utah during this time period is pretty mineral rich, correct? And so do you know of any business interests that were there that affected some of the politics as well? You know, money from big business flowing into political
Yes, of course.
people.
Yeah. Yeah. And Brigham Young said, look, there is more gold in these hills than you're going to find in the hills of California. Now, remember, there was the discovery of gold in 1849 at Sutter's Mill in California by the way, members of the Mormon Battalion.
Mm-hmm.
And there were mineral interests. And yeah, the Transcontinental Railroad was ultimately, the Golden Spike was in Promontory, Utah
Mm-hmm.
in 1863. So yeah, there was always some interest here. And of course, the more that it looked like there was going to be an incursion from both sides. Now you've got California on the one side, you've got, the United States on the other side. And the state of Deseret took in all of Nevada, the very southern part of California, almost, well, Las Vegas, there were parts of Arizona. I mean, it was huge.
Right. It
And it
stretched
was like,
up into Oregon, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, it
well,
was massive.
yeah. And yeah, went up into Idaho. I mean, it was enormous. And in fact, it was very interesting. I used to live in Nevada, and Carson Valley, Nevada was, I mean, there's a place called Genoa. And I once went into, I was in a rock and roll band once, long ago, went in to
Nice.
play in a bar, and there's a great big picture of Orson Hyde on the wall. And I was like, wait, what? I said, do you know who that is? And we're like, no, I don't know who it is. I said, that's Orson Hyde. Oh yeah, this used to be called Hyde's Bar.
Really?
Hyde had never opened the bar, but he was one of the founders of Genoa, Nevada.
That's
When
fascinating.
he, when he left, he cursed the valley and he said, if you're not going to have me here, I'm washing my feet of you people, and I hope you're all cursed. And then, of course, the casinos came, so I guess it came true. But
Right.
it was huge, and yeah, so there was a huge political state there that, I mean, all you needed to do was just look at Carson City and Virginia City and all of the gold rush that went there. So yeah, there was a lot of interest here, and we've got to take control away from these Mormons.
Okay.
So that was always an issue. Now we also get into the Civil War. Brigham Young was more than happy to just stay out of the Civil War. He was like, that isn't our war. We're out of the United States. They want to fight each other to the death. That's exactly right. That's fine. And in fact, we have that uh, prophecy on war that was given by Joseph Smith, and he said there'll be a civil war. It'll probably start in South Carolina, which it did.
Yep.
It'll be slaves against their masters, which it was. They can fight it out. We're done. Well, it's at the same time that now you have a federal bill called the Morrill, Morrill, Anti-Bigamy Act. And under that, you could not have plural marriage in any U.S. territory. Now, it was obviously focused towards Mormons. And although it's very, it was very interesting, um, because the question was just who's going to have control over the church, who's going to have control over the corporation. Well, they never really enforced the Morrill Act. And the reason it was never really enforced at that point was because the country was in the middle of a civil war. Now I'm trying to remember the name of the guy from Utah. He was a non-Mormon who he was a big wig in Washington, and he went to Lincoln and he said, "Are you really going to start sending federal troops out to Utah?" And he said, "Hey, listen, I got bigger fish to fry right now. I'm
Right.
trying to keep it together." And then he said, "If you tell Brigham Young to leave me alone, you tell Brigham Young I'll leave him alone." And then he gave this great thing. He said, when I was a boy and we would go out and plow a field, sometimes we'd run into a log in the middle of the field. And it was too wet to burn and it was too heavy to move, so we just plow around it. That's what we're going to do with the Mormons. We're just going to plow around them. We got no interest in them. They've got no interest in us. So
Seems like
you've
a
got,
pretty reasonable platform, right? I mean, that doesn't
well, it
seem.
made a lot of sense from a political standpoint. It's
Yeah.
like, you know, Buchanan already sent federal troops out there. That was a bust. You think I'm going to go out there and try and stop people from marrying who they want to marry? Look, they can do whatever they want. That's their own thing. I mean, there are other areas of Western history that are interesting. The whole reason that Nevada is a state was
Mhm.
because they came in as a union state, and the reason they came in like that was because they really needed the silver and the gold that was coming out of Nevada to to fund the war. So that's an interesting thing. They came in on Halloween, I think, in 1863.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
I think
Nevada
that's
did,
why the motto is Battleborn, right? That's the
although
Nevada motto.
there were no actual battles in Nevada, but that was the whole point. Was the motto was battle born because they needed it, and they became a state because of the battles. All right. Well, so we go further. We're in about 1870, and we've got this Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act. And here again, it's not being really enforced. They do keep sending out all of these federal people, and these federal people keep going back and saying, we can try and enforce everything that we want, but in the end, there's nothing we can do. Brigham Young is in charge. He's the big kahuna, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's about this time that the Mormons, well, in about 1876, the war is over. There's been a big debate in the tabernacle between a Reverend Newman, who was the Reverend for the U.S. Congress, and Orson Pratt. And it was a 3-day debate. And the name of the debate was, does the Bible sanction polygamy? And ultimately, Newman just had to give up and just go home with his tail between his legs. It was like, okay, the one guy you don't want to debate is Orson Pratt. Because Orson Pratt apparently wiped the floor with this guy. I mean, it was just like, it's all over the Bible. Come on, really? Was it ever rescinded in the Bible? You can't find it rescinded. So that was an interesting kind of thing. But in 1876, Section 132 was finally canonized. And so the earlier article on marriage was then taken out of the LDS Doctrine and Covenant, Section 132. Section 132 is kind of an interesting situation because it was never intended to be a revelation to the church. It was intended to be a revelation to Emma Smith. And in fact, I mean, it was, you probably know the story. I mean,
Yep.
Joseph Smith, Hiram comes to Joseph and he says, Emma's really upset about this. And, but if you'll just give me a revelation, I'll go talk to her and I'm sure she'll come around. He goes over there, she takes one look at it, throws it in the fire, says, not a revelation for me. And he goes back to Joseph and he says, this didn't turn out as well as I thought it was going to. And Joseph shakes his head and says, you don't know Emma the way that I know Emma. And here again, there had been all sorts of different, I mean, the scenarios that went on in Nauvoo, I don't have time to get into, but they are very interesting the way that all came to. But we're going to fast forward to 1876, where now you have it's now officially canonized. Now, at this point, we still have the moral act that is taking polygamy. I mean, it's illegal in any U.S. territory. Utah is still a U.S. territory. And you have a case called Reynolds versus United States. George Reynolds was actually the secretary to Brigham Young. And he said, I'll be the sacrificial lamb. I will let them arrest me. And then I am going to go ahead and challenge the constitutionality of the moral anti-bigamy law. Because we have a right. I mean, we have a religious right to do what we want to do. The Reynolds decision, which came down in 1879, has affected almost every aspect of religious freedom since then in the United States. And it's still affecting religious freedom issues here. I mean, I'll tell you how it is that it is and what the little contours of it are, but it's a disastrous mess. I'm going to read you a little bit from that decision, if I can find it here, because it's really interesting, because in the same way that they did not want to have, these, let's see if I can find it here, because it's a good one. But they based it on, we have an interest. The state has an interest in making sure that there's no such thing as polygamy, because polygamy is just plain wrong. It's just plain wrong. And if you have polygamy, you are taking things backward, and it was based on racism. Polygamy is a holdover from the Oriental races, and we all know how inferior they are. Again, let's look at the politics. Who is it that is building the Transcontinental Railroad? It's the Chinese.
Right.
Who is it that are the Orientals that might be invading the United States, mongrelizing our white people, along with those freed blacks? The Chinese. It's the Orientals. And now this group of Mormons wants to take us back to Orientalism. I mean, there is a racial aspect to it as well.
That is amazing.
And the Reynolds court also said, well, and the state has an interest in in making sure that its people are taken care of, the health, welfare, and polygamy destroys all of that. It destroys the sacred institution of marriage. So here's how it affected the rest of the religious freedom in the United States. They stated, let's see if I can find it. They stated you can believe whatever you want. You have the religious freedom to believe whatever you want, but you can't act on it. If we decide that what it is that you believe is immoral, you can't do anything about it. Of course, that begs the question, what kind of religious freedom is that?
Right.
Well, we have that same situation today. You can believe all you want that homosexuality is wrong, but if you decide to act on it by saying, I'm not going to come up with a wedding cake for a gay couple, you can't act on that because that's going to violate somebody's civil rights. That's all coming out of the Reynolds case. You can believe any damn thing you want, but you cannot act on it.
Interesting. So the Reynolds case has has impact, and I would say negative impact on anyone who would have um moral qualms with gay marriage, right? Um
Yes.
and I found that case about that baker in Colorado especially fascinating because he said, I'll bake the cake, but you need to have it decorated somewhere else, right? And it's interesting that that same tool is used continue continues to be used to beat people over the head, especially people who have religious objections or religious convictions that go against the norm.
Well, and the question, of course, is who determines the norm?
Right.
Who is it that's going to make the decision as to what is the norm? And all of that gets down to the boogeyman, politics. It always gets down to politics. Okay, I can read you this part from here. Polygamy has always been odious among the northern and western nations of Europe, and until the establishment of the Mormon Church was almost exclusively a feature of the life of Asiatic and of African people. We got polygamy in Africa. We got polygamy among the Asiatics. Obviously, these aren't Americans. Obviously, these aren't even Northern and Western European values. There's a whole racial aspect to that. Marriage, while from its very nature is a sacred obligation, it never is nevertheless, in civilized nations, a civil contract and is usually regulated by law. Upon it, society may be said to be built, and out of its fruits spring social relations and social obligations and duties which government is necessarily required to deal with. In fact, according as monogamous or polygamous marriages are allowed, do we find the principles on which the government of the people to a greater or less extent rests. Basically, it gets down to this. They're saying the state has an interest in marriage. And if we as the state make a determination as to what marriage is moral and what marriage is not moral, you got to follow us. And if you think that it's something that God told you, well, you can believe that all you want, but you can't do anything about it.
Mm.
It's a very, very difficult decision to come down with. And then this is, okay, I'll read this. Laws are made for the government of actions, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious belief and opinions, they may with practices. Suppose one believed that human sacrifices were a necessary part of religious worship. Would it be seriously contended that the civil government under which he lived could not interfere to prevent such a sacrifice? Or if a wife religiously believed it was her duty to burn herself upon the funeral pile of her dead husband, would it be beyond the power of civil government to prevent her carrying her belief into practice? So here is a law of the organization of society under the exclusive dominion of the United States. It is provided that plural marriages shall not be allowed. Can a man excuse his practices to the contrary because of his religious belief? Here's the kicker. To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land and in effect to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. Government could exist only in name under such circumstances. Well, one of the arguments that was made to the Randall's court is, wait a second. Suppose that one believes that human sacrifice is a necessary part. We don't have a long history throughout all of recorded history of human sacrifices being part of religious belief, but we do with polygamy. There are far more years of polygamy than there ever have been of monogamy. This is a tradition. We can't just simply say this is something that is exclusive to Africa or to Asia. This is something that was practiced by the very founders of the religions on which you are basing all of your law in the United States. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Old Testament, New Testament, it's there. The Supreme Court said, nope, sorry, no, we're not going to go there. We're not going to do that. That has been a difficult issue ever since, because if you simply say you can believe what you want, but you can't act on it, then where does that leave you as far as your religious belief is concerned? Right. As far as actions are concerned? Basically, it puts the laws of man in conflict with the laws of God. Now, we were talking about what happened back in the days of Joseph Smith. What do you do when there's a conflict between the laws of God and the laws of man? Well, I think David Henry Thoreau would say civil disobedience. I'll take my lumps. If it means I got to go to jail under the laws of the state, I will do it because the law of God is superior. And that actually was the position that the Mormons took. You've probably seen those pictures of these guys. You've got George Q. Cannon, who was one of the first presidency, and he's in his striped uniform there in the Utah State Prison. It's down on, it used to be around Sugar House, about 21st South in Salt Lake City. And he's surrounded by all of these priesthood brethren. They've all been arrested for cohabitation. And they're all saying, well, you can convict me. I'll go do my time, but I'm still going to be a polygamist. You can't make me not be a polygamist. And that's the question, of course, that ultimately gets down to the matters of conscience and just how much courage do you have to say, if a law is immoral or if it is violative of the law of God, I'm going to violate that law. And it's a difficult thing. I mean, we found that also in the civil rights era in the 1950s, 1960s, where Martin Luther King, they would impose some sort of an injunction on him. You can't march here. And he'd say, yes, I can. I'm a man. I'm a human being.
Right.
And you can throw me in jail, and did. There's a very awful picture of when they took Martin Luther King to jail, and they're just smashing his face against the desk as they arrest him. And his whole thing was, I'll pay the price. Because I believe that the laws of God are greater than, I was going to say Trump, but I don't want to go there this time of the year, but they are greater than the laws of man. So that's one of the issues. So outcomes, go ahead.
Real quick. I find the argument that they make there that, well, what if someone thinks that human sacrifice is a religious right? Well, I think there was a really good argument. I don't know who Reynolds' attorney was, but I think the argument would have been, look, we have a whole section of our holy books that talks about how heaven inspired the Constitution is, and that would never take place because you're violating the rights of another person, right? And I find that argument to be really disingenuous and really ill-founded that they put forward about, well, gosh, you're gonna allow polygamy. What's next? Human sacrifice? It doesn't hold water. Was there a pushback against this somehow?
The answer is sort of. Let me tell you what I mean by that. I think that it was seen generally as a political ploy, as many Supreme Court cases are.
Right.
There are a few people that sat back and said, wait a second, what are you talking about? I mean, these are the most moral people on earth. I mean, you don't have prostitution in Salt Lake City except among the non-Mormons. the Mormons don't have this issue. You're not going to find a more moral people. Why would you pick on these people because of their religious beliefs? But as I said, look at the politics always behind
Right.
what's, and that's always the issue. You need to look behind it, the politics. When we're looking at any of our current issues, things go to the Supreme Court. Gay marriage, um, uh, homosexual acts, um, the abortion issues, all of these things. We can talk about all of these different kind of highfalutin principles of, here's, we're going to found these decisions on this principle or that principle. But the one thing that I learned in law school is that principles are basically just hooks for you to hang your particular case on.
Mhm.
And many of the times when you have something in front of the Supreme Court, the principle is something that they hang the politics on.
Okay.
Politics of abortion are not based on principle so much as they are on the politics. And, most of the time we're just saying to ourselves, a lot of these issues that end up in front of the Supreme Court that are supposedly based on principle, they really ought to be taken care of by a legislature. But the problem that we have is if you happen to be part of an unpopular group, such as the Mormons were then, or a group that could be a threat politically to another group, then you're going to hang the argument on principle, but the underlying reason for it is going to be political.
Gotcha.
All right. Well, right after that, after the Reynolds case came out, then all hell broke loose. And there was the Edmunds Law, the Edmunds Act.
Edmunds Tucker, right?
Well, we're going to get to Edmunds Tucker.
Okay.
There was first the Edmunds Act, and then everything went to hell really bad, and the Edmunds Tucker Act came in.
Okay.
In 1882, George Q. Cannon he's going to go to Congress, and he's denied a seat in the House of Representatives because he's a polygamist. And then the Edmunds Act comes in, and it amends the Morrill Act. And here are the amendments. It made polygamy a felony. The very act of polygamy was a felony, but it got worse than that. It also disenfranchised polygamists. They couldn't vote. It declared them unable to hold public office. It disqualified any person who believed in the principle of polygamy from jury duty. Now, remember, they said you can believe anything you want, you just can't act on it. But if you even believe in polygamy, you can't. Why? Because if you're on a jury and somebody gets nailed for being in polygamy, you're likely to acquit that guy. So if you believe in it at all, you can't even be on a jury. It declared polygamy a felony. And then here's the thing: it defines polygamous living as unlawful cohabitation. It deprives Mormons, on the basis of their religion, from having a jury trial, which is guaranteed under, I think it's the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution. Right. It just came in and just ripped everything to shreds. And the other thing was, it also said that the Mormons could only, they said any religion in the territories cannot own more than $50,000 worth of property. Now, there was a big to-do about that. It was like, wait a second. Ooh. New Mexico is a territory, and the Catholics have got a lot more than $50,000. They made an exception for the Catholics, but they kept the Mormons in.
Of course they did.
So that's the way that went down. And so now,
and it seems it's interesting, right? Because the Edmunds Act says you can't hold public office, you can't even be on jury duty. In some ways, it feels like they're trying to politically castrate any Mormon within Utah, right?
Absolutely.
And I can almost kind of start to see the picture develop in their heads, which is unlike what Longshanks did in Scotland, where he tried to prima nocta and that sort of thing, where he would essentially breed out the Scots. This time they're just saying, we'll just make life so difficult for them that they'll bend the knee and they will assimilate. Is that a fair assessment of that?
That is exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, they're trying to basically, well, they're trying to force people to have certain beliefs if they're going to have any kind of civil rights at all. It's a stupid way to act because what's going to happen when somebody is pressing down on you and it gets down to a choice between them and God? God's going to win.
Every time.
And so what happens? You've got the entire leadership of the LDS Church that goes into hiding. You've got John Taylor, who goes into hiding after Brigham Young dies. He dies in hiding, as a matter of fact, John Taylor. And John Taylor is saying, I will rot in hell before I am going to do away with polygamy in the church. I would rather cut off my hand than sign a manifesto that does away with polygamy. But then you've got also members of the church that are going, look, buddy, they're going to destroy us. And we can have a long discussion about that, but I understand you've done quite a bit of things in your podcast about that history and John W. Taylor, John Taylor, the 1886 supposed revelation in I think it was Centerville, Utah. And I'm not going to get into that because that's going to be a point of contention between fundamentalists and LDS.
Sure.
I'm not going to jump into. But in 1887, you have the Edmunds-Tucker Act, and it is even worse. It disincorporates the church altogether and just says, you can no longer be a corporation. You can no longer be a religious institution. It grabs all the money out of the Perpetual Immigration Fund. It requires any prospective voter to raise their hand and make a declaration against polygamy. Oh, it gets worse. Up until then, one of the ideas had been among those who were opposed to polygamy, if you give women in Utah the vote, they will vote themselves out of this slavery. They franchised the women, they could vote. Utah, women could vote. Wyoming, I think, was the very first one. Idaho, women could vote. They all voted in favor of polygamy.
Yep.
So tell you what, Edmunds-Tucker, disenfranchising all women. You can no longer vote. Now, it also says that the children of polygamous marriages, or what they called, under the Edmunds-Tucker Act, illegitimate children, because after all, they hadn't come from a legitimate marriage, could not inherit property.
Oh.
I mean, basically all of the freedoms had been taken away. Now, this is what's interesting about all of this. If you're LDS, or if you grew up LDS, you've probably seen that film strip that I saw when I was a kid. It was The Windows of Heaven, and you have Lorenzo Snow, and the people aren't paying their tithing, and he gets a revelation, and he says down in St. George, if you really want to do away with this drought, you need to start paying your tithing. The question is, why weren't they paying their tithing? Was it they forgot? They're trying to defend polygamy, and they just forgot about that particular thing. No, they weren't paying tithing because they didn't want it all to go to the federal government. The government was and so it was finally when things loosened up about Edmunds-Tucker that then it was like, we got to get some money in this place. This thing is falling apart.
Holy cow. Yeah, I never put that together, but yeah, that would be right. Because under that time, any money that would have went into the church coffers was going right back into the government's pocket.
Yeah. Now remember, during all of this time, you've got all of the politics. You got the politics going. And there's a big push among members of the church, even among members of the councils of the church. And there's a huge division between them. And you've got the John W. Taylor, and you've got Matthias on one end, and you've got others on the other end, and you got Wilford Woodruff in the middle, who's just like, oh my gosh, I don't know what we're going to do. And in the end, it's like, if you will just go ahead and issue a manifesto that polygamy is no longer going to be part of it, we'll let you join as a state. Now, there's a case that was called the late corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, late being in the same way, the late Abraham Lincoln, the dead corporation, it's no longer incorporated, versus the United States. It upholds the Edmunds-Tucker Act. And it's at that point that the church capitulates and says, okay, we're going to issue a manifesto. And the manifesto came out. Of course, there is a lot of controversy as to whether it was a revelation, whether there was a revelation behind it. It certainly, as you look at it in the Pearl of Great Price, there's not anything that says, thus saith the Lord. It essentially just says, here's what it is that we're going to do from this point forward. And then 6 years later, as a condition of joining the Union in 1896, the Constitution of the state of Utah, Article 3 says, polygamous or plural marriages are forever prohibited in Utah. That was the price that it took to join the Union. Now, I'm not going to go down the long and interesting history of fundamentalist Mormonism at that point, because I think anybody who looks at the historical record, and certainly anybody who even just looks at the mainstream kind of history that's come out from D. Michael Quinn about post-manifesto polygamy, and anybody who just looks at the fundamentalist movement right now realizes that a manifesto didn't stop it. A second manifesto in 1904 didn't stop it. A third manifesto didn't stop it. I mean, polygamy did not stop. In 1904, 14 years after the manifesto, there was an attempt, well, it ultimately was a successful attempt, to seat Reed Smoot, who was not a polygamist, but who was a member of the Council of the 12 Apostles, as a senator from Utah. And there was a long investigation. There is a book that I have read. I mean, if you have some trouble getting to sleep some night, pick out just the deposition testimony that was taken in the Reed Smoot hearings, and you'll be in a coma in about 30 minutes. Joseph F. Smith, who was then the president of the church, testified. They absolutely just crushed him in the testimony that he gave. It was like, well, I don't remember this, and I don't remember that, and yes, I do have more than one wife. He admitted that he, 14 years after the manifesto, that he still had 5 wives, that he had fathered 11 children with every single one of his wives. Every single one of his wives had children. He distinguished between the law of God and the rule of the church. And that's kind of where things ended up. And then there's a whole bunch of different cases that came down as a result. And I want to talk about those because they are really, really interesting. Every time, up until even today, every time that somebody has made a claim that they are entitled as a matter of religious practice to enter into polygamy, they've lost. Every single time. All right. I'm going to read you about this case. 1946. Cleveland versus the United States. Darger versus the United States. Jessup during the United States. No, Jessup's a good fundamentalist Mormon name.
Yes. Shout out to Moroni Lopez Jessup. One of my,
yeah.
Yep.
Dockstader versus the United States. Stubbs versus the United States. Petty versus the United States. I'm going to read you the facts of this case. I didn't even know that this case existed until I was doing a little research just a little while ago. Petitioners, okay, this is 1946. Have you ever heard of the Mann Act?
No.
You ever heard of Chuck Berry?
I know Chuck Berry.
Chuck Berry. Yeah, of course you've heard of Chuck Berry. I mean, Johnny Be Good.
Dude was a wizard on the guitar.
Yeah. Johnny Be Good did some hard time in prison for violation of the Mann Act. Doing what? Taking a woman across state lines for immoral purposes.
Oh.
That was the man. Petitioners are members of a Mormon sect known as fundamentalists. They not only believe in polygamy, unlike other Mormons, they practice it. Each of these petitioners, except Stubbs, has, in addition to his lawful wife, one or more plural wives. Each transported at least one plural wife across state lines for the purpose of cohabiting with her or for the purpose of aiding another member of the cult in such a project. So they cross state lines so that they could be with their polygamous wives. They were convicted of violating the Mann Act. The act makes an offense the transportation and interstate commerce of any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. And they determined polygamy is an immoral purpose.
Is this where the argument comes in from a lot of people who are really like rabidly against just not polygamy but Mormonism in general, that there was human trafficking involved with the religion? Is this kind of where they're basing some of that off of?
Well, one of the things that's interesting, I mean, you'll find that right now, even still, that among the arguments that is made against polygamy is you take the very worst examples and then you try to generalize them. You will take a situation in which you will have an underage girl who is raped in the name of religion. And from that you say, every polygamist rapes underage girls. Well, there was nothing in this particular case that said that there was any other immoral act other than just simply being polygamously married. There was no argument about human trafficking. It was just, if I go from Utah to Arizona so that I can be with my second wife, that's an immoral purpose, and I've just violated the Mann Act.
Okay.
And it was upheld. Listen to what it said. The organization of a community for the spread and practice of polygamy is, in a measure, a return to barbarism. It is contrary to the spirit of Christianity and of the civilization which Christianity has produced in the Western world. Polygamy is a practice with far more pervasive influence in society than the casual, isolated transgressions involved in the Caminetti case, and that was a human trafficking case. The establishment or maintenance of polygamous households is a notorious example of promiscuity.
Jeez.
That was the holding of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1946. Now, here's what's interesting. There was a dissent, and I don't know how, well, let's just say for your readers or for your listeners, how this works. When there is an appellate court, there are 9 members of the U.S. Supreme Court, and there will be a majority opinion, but there may be those on the Supreme Court who disagree with that majority opinion, and they will write a dissenting opinion. If you have a unanimous court, then everybody agrees. But in this case, you had a dissent, and it went to the very issue. Now, this is a justice by the name of Murphy, who I'd never heard of before. He's not one of those that you read about when you're in law school. But he says, basically, there is no basis, in fact, for including polygamy within the phrase any other immoral purpose as used in the statute. He says, it takes no elaboration to point out that marriage, even when it occurs in a form of which we disapprove, is not to be compared with prostitution or debauchery or other immoralities of that character. In other words, if they're married and we just don't like it, we can't say that it's barbaric.
Right.
We can't say it's into prostitution. We can't say that it's debauchery. All we can say is we don't like it. Well, that's not enough of a basis to send somebody to prison for violation of the Mann Act. Because if we come to the point where it's not a matter of principle anymore, it's a matter of policy, then whatever you can get a majority of people to not like, that's what it is that's going to nail you. And in this case, I mean, we'll talk about that a little later when it talks about, gay marriage. Well, it went from something that was not liked to now something that is, I don't know if we'd say that it's liked, but it is accepted. And now if you were to take somebody across state lines so that you could participate in an anti-gay rally, who knows? That might be a violation of the Mann Act. We just don't know. So we've got that case, and that is an interesting case. In the meantime, we have a couple of cases that come down, and I referenced them in my in the thing that I wrote for the ABA. And I don't know if have you got you put up show notes?
Yeah, we can put up the show notes
You might,
after we're done recording. If you can email them to me.
you might just
Oh,
want to put up
you already
my
emailed
article.
that to me, right?
Yeah, I did. I did.
Yep, I'll put that in the show notes.
Okay. And there have been some interesting cases that have come down. There have been a couple in Utah there because of course that's where most polygamists live and that's where it becomes an issue. There was one that came up in 1984, Potter versus Murray City. Now Murray, of course, is one of the it's a suburb of Salt Lake City. And in that case, you had a police officer who kept it down on the down low, but he was a polygamist. Somebody finds out, somebody doesn't like it. They go after him and say, if he is intended to be a police officer who's going to enforce the law, he has to obey the law. He argued, I have a right, a religious right, to be a polygamist. You can't interfere with this. Reynolds was decided wrong. Now, this was a Utah state case. And tell me if I'm running too late as we go into this stuff.
No, dude, we got all the time in the world.
Okay. Well, let me explain a little bit for your listeners who kind of need to understand a little bit about how the systems work. We have two different systems in the court systems of the United States. One of them is the state system, and each state has its own court system. And that's the ones where criminal cases are, and that's where a lot of property cases are. And then you have the federal system, and there are state crimes and there are federal crimes. Each state has its own police. I mean, each municipality has its own police force, and then you will have a state police force. You'll have the highway patrol, which is a state police force. You have a federal police force, which is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Okay, so you've got two different areas here. So this was a state case. This was a case that was brought in Utah State Court because they claim this man needs to be, he's violating the Utah state law by being a police officer and violating the law. He made the argument, hey, you can't, oh wait, no, I'm sorry. This was a federal case because he said, I have a religious right, and religious rights usually are considered to be federal rights. I'll get to the state cases in a minute. So he says, look, there's no compelling state interest in making sure that I am not married to more than one wife. It is, they find against him in the District Court of Utah, and he appeals to the federal district courts. There are 13 federal districts. There are 11 of those have to do with states. For example, the state of Utah is in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. California is in the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. There is also there's a federal Court of Appeals, and there's also a District of Columbia Court of Appeals. Now, all of that is, I'll tell you what happens there. If you lose in the District Court of Utah, federal district court, you appeal to the 10th Circuit. If you lose in the 10th Circuit, you can appeal to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court can either take it or not take it. Well, in this case, the 10th Circuit took it, and they said, the Reynolds case, Reynolds, it's over 100 years old, is still good law. And we are still going to uphold the idea that polygamy is a social harm, and therefore you lose your job because you believe in polygamy, because you're a polygamist. 84. Then we go to State versus Green. A guy by the name of, I'm trying to remember his first name, I think it's Tom Green. And he was a polygamist. And he is arrested in state court. It's a state crime that he goes after. And they basically said, the anti-bigamy law is facially neutral. It applies to everybody. It's not just focused toward polygamists toward the fundamentalists. And so it's a good law, and you are convicted of a violation of the bigamy law. State case. That was in 2004.
Okay.
So now we're getting up to where we are. State versus Holm. Guy by the name of Rodney Holm. 2006. He's a member of the FLDS. And it's kind of an ugly case. Holm is convicted of bigamy and unlawful sexual conduct with a 16-year-old woman, his third religious wife. And they don't get into green. They just said, sorry, you're convicted, you're done. Now, one of the things that came up was, well, wait a minute. In the meantime, by 2006, you have the case where the sodomy laws in Texas that outlaw homosexual conduct had been struck down. And one of the things that Holmes said was, wait a minute, who are you to regulate my sexual conduct with anybody? I mean, they didn't even claim child abuse here, but who are you to do that? If homosexuals can have sex and the anti-sodomy laws were struck down, why not the polygamy laws? They just ignored that altogether. They just said, that's homosexuality, this is polygamy. It's a messy case.
Yeah.
Hold on. There's more.
I just want to say the amount of guys in fundamentalism that are taking underage brides, with the exception of a few groups, is pretty much nil, right? It's not happening these days, by and large, because I know a lot of fundamentalists. And it's something that, quite frankly, as a dad with daughters, I kept my eye out for, right? And I want to make it clear, I'm not advocating for a 43-year-old guy to marry a 16-year-old girl, right? I don't think that that is definitely something that should be done at all. I think it's morally irreprehensible, because this is what happens. We get beat with it later because of a couple morons, quite frankly, right? And I just wanted to put that out there because, like I said, 99.9% of the guys I've met in fundamentalism, and I've met a lot, that crap just wouldn't fly.
I don't want to pick on any particular group, but I will say this. The FLDS have not done the Mormon fundamentalist community any favors
Oh,
in the things that have ultimately gone to court. Warren Jeffs has not done anybody any favors, because what happens is every Mormon fundamentalist of every stripe is tarred with that particular brush.
yes.
And as a result, we end up with the kind of Facebook posts that you get where it's like child abuse, bestiality, this. That's what gets thrown at the fundamentalists, every fundamentalist. And I think that you are probably right. Now, I'm not connected with the fundamentalist community, but just looking at it from the legal standpoint, 99% of the bad cases that come down have come down as a result of the FLDS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That just happens to be the truth.
Yep.
This case, Barlow versus Blackburn, it's an Arizona case in 1990. It was similar to the other one. Barlow was actually a police officer in Colorado City.
Mm-hmm.
And they stripped him and said, the guy believes in polygamy. And again, they relied on the Reynolds case. So up until now, Reynolds has been good law. And then we come up to one of my very favorite cases. And it has to do with Cody Brown. Now, I have not actually ever watched Sister Wives. My wife used to watch it. And I've got a sister-in-law who can tell you where every single one of his wives is and what they are doing. I mean, she just used to follow it, to phrase it, religiously. She used to watch it all the time. Well, Cody Brown's situation was interesting. He was living in Lehi, which is in Utah County, Utah. And you had the first episode of Sister Wives that went on. And of course, there seems to be some sort of a fixation about polygamy on some of these cable channels. You had that. You had the case in which you had, oh gosh, there's been a couple of them. There was one Searching for Sister Wives. Drew Briney, who is another lawyer, well, former lawyer, he
Had him
has,
on the podcast several times.
yeah, uh, I've corresponded with him. I don't know him personally, but he was the subject of one of these shows. Well, as soon as the first episode of Sister Wives comes on, somebody calls up the Utah County Attorney's Office and says, "Are you going to prosecute this guy?" And the Utah County Attorney, a guy by the name of Jeffrey Buman, says, "Well, maybe I might prosecute him for polygamy." At
Mm.
which point, Cody Brown says, "I'm going to challenge Utah's anti-polygamy law." And it went in front of a judge by the name of Clark Wattups, who in 2013 came up with an opinion. Now, let me tell you about Judge Wattups, who I like quite a bit. I like him a lot. He was a George Bush appointee, who you would expect would be fairly conservative. And he struck down the law in Utah. He said it is not constitutional. And he used several bases on it. He said, first of all, Reynolds was just simply wrong. And if you look at it in light of the current situation out there, it just can't apply. It's obviously discriminatory. It makes no sense from a principle standpoint. He also said it's based on racism, and he referenced those issues that I'd mentioned before, and he struck it down. And the state of Utah took it up to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals is made up of a number of judges. And I can't remember how many judges there are. There's a lot of them. There's like 15 judges on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And what they will do is they will divide up different cases for different panels. One of the members of the panel was a guy by the name of Scott Matheson. Scott Matheson is the son of a former governor of Utah.
Mm.
Now, I'm projecting here my own opinion, but I don't think the 10th Circuit wanted to be the district that overturned the polygamy law in Utah. They didn't go to the merits of the case. They didn't talk about Reynolds. They didn't talk about whether it was based on racism, whether it was based on religious discrimination. They argued that there was no standing on the part of Cody Brown. Let me tell you what that means. In order for you to bring a case, whether it is in state court or in federal court, you have to show that you have some skin in the game. You have to be able to show that that is actually affecting you. Well, Cody Brown said, "Of course I've got standing. This guy said he would prosecute me. If he's threatening prosecution, I do have skin in the game." Let me read what the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals said. The defendants in the case, which were Buman, but also Utah County, and I think the state of Utah, made a motion to dismiss for lack of standing. Attached to the motion was a declaration signed by Mr. Shurtleff, who was the Utah Attorney General at the time, in which he declared that his office had a policy not to prosecute polygamists under Utah criminal bigamy statute just for the sake of practicing polygamy. They would only initiate prosecutions against someone who had committed child or spouse abuse, domestic violence, welfare fraud, or some other crime. And he said, my predecessors in recent memory had followed that policy. So you've got the state coming in and saying, well, he doesn't have standing because we never prosecute people just for polygamy. It has to be something else. Defendants also attached a declaration from Mr. Buman signed under penalty of perjury. And he said, even though we don't have a formal declared policy, we don't have any recollection of ever having prosecuted anyone for polygamy. But he said he had not stated publicly that he would or would not prosecute the Browns. So what he's basically saying is, we haven't prosecuted him yet, but we might. So standing? No standing. Well, if you just use what it is that they've said, Buman is still out there saying, I might prosecute you. Well, if you might prosecute me, I think I've got standing. Here's where everything falls apart for them. They make another motion to dismiss after it was clear that they were going to lose. Buman files a second declaration in which he announced he had now adopted a formal office policy regarding polygamy prosecutions, which is the policy that had been adopted by the Attorney General. In other words, you know what? We're going to lose. I'm going to come up with a declaration that says I'm not going to prosecute. Okay, everybody clear on this thing? Not going to prosecute, and therefore there's no standing. And that's what the 10th Circuit said. Well, if he said no harm, no foul, okay, Brown's not going to get prosecuted. He has no standing. Boom, done. Overturned the entire win that Brown had won in front of the district court.
Ugh.
Right now, that's where everything stands.
No, but Utah essentially decriminalized polygamy just a few
That's our
years.
next.
Okay, sorry.
That's what I want to talk about next. Right now, like it or not, and I don't like it much, Reynolds is still good law. I think that if somebody were to make a facial challenge to it and it were actually heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, it would have a good chance of being overturned. But that case has not arisen yet. So what does Utah do about it? Well, due to the efforts of a lot of polygamists, a lot of fundamentalists, and also some other people, and it was not opposed by the LDS Church as well, there has been the decriminalization of polygamy in Utah. Now, let me tell you what that means. It's not legalization, decriminalization. Those are two different concepts.
Mm-hmm.
The legalization would say it's legal to be a polygamist. Decriminalization says, if you're a polygamist, we can write you a traffic ticket. It will be an infraction. You'll get a $10, $50 fine, and that's it. Now, is the state going to actually start issuing traffic tickets to polygamists? No. So for all intents and purposes, they've done away with it. And it's not on the basis of polygamy, it's on the basis of bigamy. But they've said, but if you have bigamy with, again, child abuse, spousal abuse, welfare fraud, any of those things, then it turns into a felony. So how is it that they got away around that thing in the Utah Constitution that says polygamy will forever be banned? Well, it's kind of still banned. It's still an infraction. It's still kind of a criminal case, but not really. That's how we get around it. Now, what about the other states? What about Missouri, for example? What about Ohio? What about Arizona? Have they decriminalized polygamy? They have not. And so there is still, at least in theory, the chance that somebody could be prosecuted for bigamy. Now, I do not know the elements of every bigamy statute in every state. I did look up the one in Missouri. I don't think that it would apply to this particular situation, but that's for a court to decide. That's not for me to decide. I don't practice law in Missouri, although I have had a couple of cases there. So that's the state of the law right now. So the question that I think that many of your listeners are asking themselves is, after this very long diatribe on my part, where do things stand? Mm-hmm. Well, it's not going to go away. I mean, it is probably, I think, probably more common now than it has ever been in the United States, at least since the manifesto. Is it going to, are there going to be prosecutions for polygamy? I don't think so. And I think here's the reason why. I think that any state attorney general who reads the Reynolds decision is going to have to say, in light of the gay marriage cases, in light of the sodomy cases, it's awfully difficult to maintain that polygamy is substantially different from a legal principle standpoint than they are. Now, I'm going to give you another little primer here, and then we'll quit. religious rights cases right now are always in a state of flux. Do you believe this? Can you believe that? Can you act in this way? Can you not? Most of the cases involving religious cases have more to do with property rights or liberty rights or association rights. The court doesn't want to jump in usually to say what is a valid religious argument and what is not. Although they do say that polygamy is actually a harm to society.
Right.
But they don't want to come in and say, if you believe in God, that's wrong. They're not going to get into that. If you believe that, if you believe in baptism by immersion, that's right or that's wrong. They're probably not going to get into that. The question then gets down to, well, yeah, but what can you believe in? What is it that you know? Usually they get down to issues of, do I have liberty? Do I have a liberty interest? Now, there's one interesting principle that was the basis of Roe versus Wade, which is the abortion case that back in the 1970s, it was just overturned. And in that case, I mean, I argued this case when I was in law school. It had come out within 10 years of when I was in law school. And I think I was the only person in the entire classroom who said that it was an idiotic decision. It came out, and the basis of it was you have a right of privacy under the Constitution. Now, the Constitution doesn't say anything about privacy, but you can what they said was there's a penumbra, which basically is a big Latin word for umbrella. And if you look at especially all of the Bill of Rights, you can sort of see that there's a right of privacy. I mean, you have a right not to have officers come storming into your house without a warrant. Right. Well, that's privacy. You have a right not to have to, you have a right to be able to marry whoever you want. That's a right of privacy. And then they went on and said, and you have a right to have an abortion because that's between you and your doctor, and there are no other rights that are involved. Now, I don't want to go too far down this road, but I said, well, there are other rights involved. There is the right of a child to be born.
Right.
And that was my position. It was a very unpopular position in law school. And the other thing I argued was Roe versus Wade is on a collision course with itself because they say there's no state interest in the first 3 months, the first trimester of a pregnancy. Ooh. It's between a woman and a doctor. The second trimester, the state might have some interest. And in the third trimester, the state might be able to jump in. But in no case did they ever say the unborn child has any interest. But my argument in law school, now this is back in the 1980s, was, well, listen, as medical science progresses, the viability of the child is going to be further down the road. It could be 15 weeks, could be 20 weeks. And at that point, does the child, if viability is the issue, doesn't it have some rights at that point? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a collision course because what's happened is you said that there's a constitutional right, but that constitutional right is based on current medicine. But that medicine is going to change. Now, the only reason that I bring that up is this right of privacy. The right of privacy was also the basis of the sodomy laws. They said your right of privacy to do whatever you want in a homosexual relationship is none of the state's business. You should get out of that. The right of privacy had to do with the gay marriage cases, saying your right of privacy, your right to have association with whoever it is that you want and be married to them legally, you have a right to do that. Now, let's also find that distinction between the gay marriage cases and the polygamy cases. In the gay marriage cases, they wanted to actually go get state sanction and say, I want to get married to my boyfriend, and we deserve a marriage license. We want to involve the state in it. The polygamy cases have been, we don't want the state involved in this at all. We'll get a license for the first marriage if that's what you really want, but we don't even think that you need a license for that. I mean, there are a lot of people who are unmarried who cohabit, who actually act as if they're married. In fact, that's why we have common law marriage. Mm-hmm. We don't want you to be involved in this thing. We just want to be able to live the way we want to, if we want to have a second wife or a 10th wife or whatever, because it's a religious ceremony, just stay out of our lives. And yet we still have the courts saying rentals is still good law. And regardless of how it is that you get into this marital relationship, it's a social harm. Now, one more last point here. If the right of privacy extends to abortion, and it extends to homosexual acts, and it extends to gay marriage, the normal argument would be it also extends to polygamous marriage relationships. That's the case that I think the Supreme Court doesn't want to hear, because they don't want to overturn Reynolds, and because the only people who are really pushing it are fundamentalist Mormons. You're not even going to find the LDS Church that's going to get behind it at this point. I mean,
Right.
you have done some things in your podcast about the evolution of the church's stance with regard to polygamous relationships, and I don't need to go down that road. There's one other aspect of it, though, and just look at it this way. The bigamy statutes would say, if I am married and I have a relationship with someone else who is or is not married, and I hold that out as a marriage relationship, I'm in violation of the bigamy law. That's the way it works. There was a case that came down in Utah. Christine Durham, who was one of the Utah Supreme Court justices, said, well, wait a second. What about somebody who's married? They don't get a divorce. They just live separately, and he gets a girlfriend. And for all intents and purposes, they're a couple. Aren't they in violation of the bigamy law? And the answer came back, well, yeah, but they didn't go get it solemnized by a pastor. It wasn't a religion. They just decided to shack up together. That's completely different. Well, that's obvious religious discrimination. So right now, where do things stand? Things stand in sort of a state of limbo. And if somebody comes to me as their lawyer and says, do I have anything to worry about? The answer would generally be, I don't think you've got much to worry about. But here again, you've just got to decide, am I going to take the chance? Actually, in everything that I do as a lawyer, I'd just say, here's what the chances are. If you do this, here's what the chances of this are going to happen. If you do this, this are the chances. Right now, for me, for anybody coming in and saying, I married another woman, I went to the AUB, or I'm an independent, and I got married. You know, my wife is 32 years old. My second wife is 30 years old. My third wife is 28 years old, and we all got married in the AUB. Do I need to worry that somebody's going to come and, you know, they're gonna knock me out of, they're gonna arrest me for anti-bigamy? The answer would be, I think the chance of that is 0.0000001%. So
Maybe because the courts don't want to deal with it.
they just don't want to deal with it. I mean, there was a case that came in federal court, and it was actually a guy from the FLDS. And he went down to the county clerk in Salt Lake City and said, I demand that you give me a marriage license so that I can get married to my second wife. And they said, no, no, that violates it. But most of the time, people in fundamentalist relationships, they don't want the state involved at all. They just want to be left alone.
Right.
So one of the things that I know that you're big on is we come out of the shadows. So the question is, if we come out of the shadows, are we liable to all go to jail? The answer is, I don't see much chance of that ever happening. And I honestly think that, like it or not, whatever the evangelical Christians or anybody who doesn't like Mormonism in any stripe say, they don't like gay marriage anymore than they like Mormons. So I'm not really sure that it's going to be a big issue where they're going to come out and say, no, we need to come up with a second Edmund Tucker Act. I just don't see that happening in today's world.
Okay.
So that's my spiel. Any questions?
Yeah, I got a few here.
Sure.
So with these folks that have been, quite frankly, rattled, right? Up in Daviess County in Missouri,
Yeah.
do they have any legal recourse at this point?
I'm going to give you the lawyerly answer. This is the answer to about 9/10 of the cases that come into my office. It depends. Let me tell you what I mean by that. There is obviously at least a perceived threat against people on the basis of their religion. And it is a perceived threat that comes from a state actor. Now, I'm going to give you a bunch of legal gobbledygook that will all hopefully come into focus. I used to work for the city attorney's office in Reno, Nevada. And then I worked for the city attorney's office in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I defended a lot of police officers. Under the law, under the civil rights laws, if a state actor, someone who is acting, and the magic words in the law are under color of state law. So it could be a policeman, it could be somebody who is a doctor working in a hospital, it could be a mayor, it could be somebody who is acting under color of state law. If they take away somebody's civil rights, they can sometimes be held criminally liable, which was the case with George Floyd. He was prosecuted for violation of Floyd's civil rights, killing him, taking away his right to life under color of state law. And they could be subject to a civil action. And I used to defend cops who were accused of beating somebody up. Well, you take away somebody's right to liberty, or you take away their right of association, or you beat them up. That is somebody under color of state law who is taking away somebody's civil right. And I would have to defend those cases. And sometimes I would win, sometimes I would lose. Now, the question is a threat enough to say that you're taking away somebody's right? The answer is maybe. I don't know that a simple threat will do it. It certainly seems defamatory, and it certainly seems focused on somebody because of the basis of their religion. The defense will be, well, no, I was just talking generally, and I wasn't talking about these guys necessarily. I was just taking anybody who believes in polygamy and child abuse and bestiality and all these terrible things that I just said. Well, you and I know that that's focused on these particular people. Would that necessarily fly in court? Once again, depends on what 12 people who are too dumb to get out of jury duty think. I don't know. But it seems to me that they can certainly raise the issue. This smacks of religious discrimination, and it's got to stop.
Okay.
That I think they do. Would they prevail if they could hire a lawyer and the lawyer would say, yeah, I'll take this all the way to the US Supreme Court? I don't know. If they've been arrested for nothing more than polygamy, or if somebody came over to their house and said, I think that you are, I'm going to beat you up because you're a polygamist. A cop takes out his nightstick and starts pounding on people. Yeah, you'd have a case. You'd have a much stronger case.
Okay.
That's probably not the best answer, but that's my lawyerly answer.
So as an attorney, if this was me talking to you, I was the offended party. I was living in Daviess County. What would be your recommendations to me? Would it be to stop living plural marriage? Would it be to move? Would it be to just go about my business until something worse happened? What's your thoughts?
Well, I certainly wouldn't tell you to stop living plural marriage. I mean, that is a fundamental tenet of your religious belief. And I don't believe that somebody who puts out a Facebook post has any right to try and discourage you from living a tenet of your religious belief.
Okay.
Unless you're taking away somebody's life, liberty, or property as a result of that, I can't see that there's any reason for that ever to happen. Now, if I felt threatened, and as I read that, there was sort of an implied threat, if I felt threatened, I'm not sure that I would do anything except maybe sit down with the sheriff or sit down with somebody in the county council or say, and just say, look at what's going on here. This has got to stop. But because you need it to stop. And that's essentially what the Mormons always did. They always just said, look, if you'll just stop persecuting us, we can all live together. You don't get to beat up on us, burn down our houses, rape our women, throw us out of Missouri because you don't like our beliefs. And you don't like the fact that we have some political power. that was an instance in which they truly were victims. So would I tell you to stop living your religion? Absolutely not.
Okay.
Would I tell you to be worried? Not much.
Okay.
But I would sit down and say, this nonsense has got to stop. You can't go after us for this. I mean, imagine if, well, let's put it in this situation, and this is more political than anything. Imagine that instead of being focused on fundamentalist Mormons, let's face it, Mormons of any stripe are still not that popular in the United States.
No.
No matter how much the mainline LDS Church tries to make it more palatable to the rest of society, we saw what happened when Mitt Romney was running. I mean, we really want a Mormon as a president? I mean, we're not even sure that that guy's loyal to the United States. So, but imagine that instead of a fundamentalist Mormon, it was directed toward a Jew, or it was directed toward a Muslim. All hell would break loose. You'd have people down there picketing and saying, wait a minute, you'd have somebody from the Anti-Defamation League of the Jewish, I mean, all hell would break loose. And they may not sue, they may sue, but it would be a different story. Well, if it's based on principle, the principle is the same. You can't pick on me because I'm fundamentalist Mormon, or because I am a mainline Mormon, or because I'm a Jew, or because I'm an evangelical Christian, or because I'm a Muslim, or whatever it may be. And again, let's remember what the categories are that are the basis of basic civil rights: race, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation. All of those are considered to be protected classes. You cannot discriminate against somebody on those bases. Let me put it in a different focus here for a second. I have people come to me all the time and they say, I have been fired from my job. Do I have any recourse? And I will say, was it on the basis of race, religion, national origin, sex, age, sexual orientation? Because if the answer to any of those is yes, you have some recourse because those are protected classes. If the answer to those is no, he just didn't like the way I parted my hair, the answer is he can fire you because this is an at-will state. But there's certain classes of individuals that are protected, and religion is one of those classes, regardless of what religion it is.
Okay. All right. So maybe the answer is for all of us, you know, fundamentalists to get a little more vocal.
I can tell you what I did in a case recently. It had nothing to do with religion. I had a guy come into my office and he said, the city of Farmington, Utah, wants to take away my farm. It's adjacent to a public park, and they want to condemn it and take it away from me. And I have talked to every law firm in downtown Salt Lake City, and they've all told me the same thing. You can't fight City Hall, and you just try to make the best deal you can. And he was like, well, wait a minute. This is my living. I'm a farmer. I mean, and this is a matter of pride for me. I mean, you can't imagine what I had to go through to make sure that the soil had the proper pH in it and all of that stuff. I'm a farmer. They want to just come in and make a soccer field out of it. I mean, in Farmington, it's not called Soccer Town. I want to live in Farmington. I want to have a farm in Farmington. And I said, I can save your farm. And here's why. All of the other lawyers that you've talked to, they want to bring a knife to a gunfight. I'm going to bring a gun to a gunfight. This is not a legal issue. This is a political issue. And I raised hell. And I had public hearings in front of the Farmington City Council. And I had petitions out there, save the farm in Farmington. And you'll be surprised at when you have an entire room full of people who are saying, don't step on me. Suddenly their hearts and minds will change. It may well be that for your folks, the best thing to do is to say, you know what? We are coming out of the shadows. We're not doing anything that's wrong. We're not doing anything that's immoral. You can't threaten us just because you don't like us. That might be the answer. And because like I said, much of this does not really rely on legal principles. much of the things that even the early Mormons were dealing with weren't really religious and legal principles. It was politics. Turn the politics around and make it work for you.
Okay. That's good stuff. And just kind of ramp up from there, right? Always avoiding violence. I want him to get that out there right now. Never get violent, but continue to ramp up the pressure and go to court if we have to.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, violence, especially political violence, you can't lose a fight faster than if you're violent.
Right.
But if you go in and say, I'm not voting for you, and I'm going to go out and campaign, I'm going to knock door to door against for your opponent in the next election.
Okay.
In fact, I've got to tell you a story about this case that I had. We had a big public hearing in Farmington, and my my client, the farmer, he says, that guy over there, he's standing up and he's going to make a comment. And I don't know what he's going to say. I mean, I've been in competition with this guy for years. You know, he's 85 years old and he may get up and say that they probably ought to take my farm. This old guy gets up and he goes, I've been farming over in Farmington for the last 60 years. And you want to put a soccer field on a farm? I got to tell you, I got a better place for this soccer field to go. It's this ramshackle, terrible house that ought to be knocked down. I'll put a soccer field there. It's your house, Mr. Mayor. Why don't we knock that thing down? The place, of course, nuts. Everybody's just going crazy. But in the end, you know, the mayor's up there. I mean, he's turning 6 shades of purple. But in the end, yeah, no violence. But step out of the shadows. Say, wait a minute. We don't deserve to be discriminated against because you don't happen to like my religion.
Right. Okay, I just want to say a few things in conclusion, then I'm going to throw it right back to you, Randall, to wrap this all up for us. First, before Randall and I ever sat down to have this conversation, I went ahead and I called the county commissioners as well as the sheriff's office in the county where this happened to just kind of get their take on it, right? To see where they fell on it. I haven't heard anything back yet from the county in question. Second, if you're living in the county where this post was made, please, please, please remain civil. I understand that this kind of thing and this kind of remark and thinly veiled threat, I understand that it's jarring. But nevertheless, we must exercise restraint in our rhetoric while we're standing up for our rights that are guaranteed to us by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But nonetheless, as followers of Christ, we should always seek first for reconciliation. Finally, please know that this will not be ignored. I have been aware that there are people looking into what their potential options might be legally, and I'm going to continue to follow this for as long as it takes to get resolved because this is important. Not only does this affect us as Mormons, but this affects anybody who might be targeted just because of their religious beliefs and practices. And I want to make sure that this gets followed through with. And so I'm going to be continuing to look at this until we get some sort of resolution here.
There is a point beyond which you just finally ultimately have to say, we're not going to take this anymore. And it is, I mean, with every different group, it's a different point. I can tell you with my guy, it was like at the point where they were going to take away his land. With some people, it's a point where they're coming in and they're saying, we as the state want to tell you how to run your life. And sometimes it's political, sometimes it's legal. I actually always prefer the political because then you actually have those who are in control of the laws deciding what it is that's going to be done. I honestly believe that if you sit down with the sheriff, or better yet, you sit down with the county council or whoever it is and say, is this really the way you want to treat our citizens here, our tax-paying citizens here? Is this really what you want to do because you don't like our religion? You want to allow these kinds of threats to go on? I think you'll get a response.
Okay. All right. Dude, this was fun. Let's do this again.
Hope I didn't bore you to death with all of this.
No, dude, that was fascinating stuff because quite frankly, that's not something I've ever approached it by is the politics of it, right? The political implications of all of this. I found it fascinating. So yeah, let and look. I've said this on the podcast the whole time. I talk to people that fascinate me, and then everyone gets to come for the ride, and people have kept tuning in. So, I'm on to something here. So, but dude, let's do this again.
Sure.
All right, fantastic. Anything else you want to say in conclusion, or
No, I think you're doing good work. And I think the more that we can educate people about where we stand, what's going on, where we've been, where we're looking to the future, the better we are. But I don't want anybody to walk away from this podcast feeling like I'm helpless. I have nowhere to turn. Because the fact of the matter is, there's a long history here. Understanding it will kind of tell you where you are, but it'll also give you hope for the future, I think.
absolutely? Well, dude, that was good stuff. Let's do it again and hang out 5 minutes here after I turn this off.
Sure.
All right, bye everybody.